Hello and welcome to a podcast for an upcoming concert of the Yakima Symphony Orchestra in Yakima, Washington. My name is Jeff Snedeker. I'm principal horn with the orchestra, and this is our music director, Maestro Golan. Our next program features a combination of interesting musical styles. It's a bit of classical and a bit of jazz, and the pieces featured on this program have an interesting sort of historical significance in different ways to the mix of classical and jazz. The concert that I'm referring to will be held Saturday, October 9th, 2010 at 7:30 p.m. and a second performance Sunday, October 10th at 2:00 p.m. at the Seasons Performance Hall in Yakima, Washington. So let's talk a little bit about the pieces. It's an interesting concept. I think people have tried it for years. We've seen lots of programs. Sometimes they're called Pops concerts. But this one is not a Pops concert, right? It's more to it than that.
It's actually on our chamber orchestra series, and it's in conjunction with the Seasons Fall Festival. And as some of our viewers may know, the Seasons Festival is all about the juxtaposition of jazz and classical. So this concert obviously fits right in with that. And the idea behind the programming of the concert, well, we start with Joplin, Two Rags by Joplin. And the thing about ragtime is that it's not actually jazz music. It's classical music in the sense that it's written out note for note and nothing is left to be improvised or embellished by the performers. But it was actually a precursor to jazz, and the ragtime style with all its syncopations was very influential to jazz musicians. So it's almost like a bridge between classical and jazz.
And the pieces you've chosen, both by Scott Joplin, are pretty well-known pieces, I would say.
They are. They were both featured in the film The Sting.
Right, right. Very, very popular. And what's interesting about them is that, I mean, Scott Joplin was a sort of interesting, in some ways sort of tragic, and in other ways very, very important performer of this style and promoter of this style. Born in Texas and kind of worked his way north and then east, and was I think, well, is probably the most recognizable name associated with ragtime music. Many people would be surprised to know that he wrote operas in that ragtime style, and he tried to apply the style to these larger forms. Some of them were a bit interesting at the time, but it really didn't catch on because that particular type of music was sort of progressing pretty quickly at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know what you alluded to, the tragedy of his life is, I mean, he was somewhat well known in his time, but really his great fame came years and years after his death, in part due to the movie The Sting, which really helped to lead a revival of interest in ragtime in general and the music of Scott Joplin in particular.
Right. There were also some recordings that came out about the same time.
By Gunther Schuller.
Gunther Schuller was one of those.
Player,
that's right.
Like yourself.
And Joshua Rifkin did the piano thing. But Gunther Schuller is an interesting case because this is a gentleman who, if there's truly a Renaissance man of the 20th century, it's Gunther Schuller. I wonder sometimes, sort of like Leonard Bernstein, how he could possibly stay awake long enough to accomplish all that he did. Truly a genius in many ways. But at the time, ragtime music became a bit more popular. He became director of the New England, thank you, gap there, New England Conservatory, where and took it upon himself, in a sense, to create this sort of ragtime orchestra. Very interesting concept because there is some sort of historical basis for it, but yet, because, you know, obviously dance bands played all sorts of styles. But it is a rather interesting adaptation of that concept because the instrumentation is sort of what you'd expect and sort of not, you know. But it definitely, the orchestrations themselves, I think, capture the style beautifully with the syncopation and that sort of hot energy to it that fits that sort of dance hall.
You know, I think I would just point out to our listeners and our viewers that the syncopation you refer to is what leads to the name ragtime, because in the left hand of the piano, it's essentially steady, and the right hand is syncopated, and when you combine the two, it's somewhat ragged.
Ragged, yes.
And that's
right,
where ragtime
right.
comes from.
Right, right. So the second piece on the program, however, is at the opposite end of the spectrum, where ragtime is early jazz. The piece of music by Tom Harrell is quite current, or
Quite current, yes.
Yeah.
The music that we'll be playing after the two rags is a suite of pieces from the Wise Children album of the famous jazz trumpeter Tom Harrell. They're original compositions of his, and we've selected 4 from that album to play. And yeah, I think the audience will like them. Do you have any background on Tom Harrell?
Well, the CD that it came out it was about 2003, and what was quite striking about that is, as other jazz composers and performers have done in the past, there's a little mix of timbres, which is pretty nice. And you've got, you know, Charlie Parker did a recording with a whole string section with just him playing over strings, and it was beautiful. And it had a certain character to it, but at the same time, you got the feeling it was sort of put on by the producer to try a new thing. You know?
Wasn't natural.
Yeah, it's different with Tom Harrell, because Tom Harrell is a creative mind that's very well known among jazz musicians and jazz performers. It's just a very spontaneous, a very sort of ongoing creativity where it doesn't stop. And so when people hear classical music or classical instruments put into a jazz scenario, they can get a little suspicious sometimes. But I was very struck by this. This is one of those, which of course there are others, but this is one of those where it's really, I think, quite genuine. I really like the combinations of where he's got, you know, some nice brass writing that have some very colorful harmonies. The string writing, I think, is really quite provocative. The harmonies also are kind of interesting and very close, and yet it really does have a nice sense of flow to it. The melodies and, in a couple of cases, the rhythms are really quite striking.
You know, one thing that might add to that is the fact that it's not a full romantic-sized string section.
Right.
It's actually one on a part. So, you know, 1 first violin, 1 second violin, 1 viola, 1 cello, 1 bass. And, you know, sometimes the overly produced types of recordings you're talking about earlier, you know, they try to put this Hollywood, you know, rush romantic string sound in there, and that might be what gives it that little bit of cheesiness.
Yeah, right, right. Well, this isn't cheesy. No,
right.
This is not cheesy at all. And I think particularly this combination of movements with you know, some softer, more lyrical things, a ballad type, and then definitely some you know, African, absolutely, with lots and lots of different rhythmic stuff. Make it very, very interesting, I think, and it'll be fun to play it. I mean, Tom Harrell is a terrific performer, and has been doing it for a while, and it'll be fantastic to have him here as well to work with us, and also to perform with him. It should be quite interesting.